All right, welcome to week 15. Again, this week we're talking about domestic and economic policy. Um, it's not the best chapter as far as, really kind of detailing domestic policy. And of course, I think part of that is because presidents tend to have sort of an opaque view of all the different, programs and policies that run, below them. Certainly, presidents have primary responsibility for the budget. They have to initiate that process, and being able to speak first has an important an important influence over the budgetary process. But it's not decisive because at the end of the day, for example, uh, Trump wanted to cut quite a bit of funding to the Department of Education, but frankly, both Republicans and Democrats in the House and the Senate are simply not going to go along with it. They're going to hold that budget probably harmless, and so Trump's expectation that he's going to get his way on some of these budget issues are going to end up not being realized. Um, Again, a big part of this, and we always need to remember that kind of the origin point, and why presidents play such an important role in the budgetary process is that because presidents are basically directing a ton of executive agencies, um, Congress subsequently is like saying, you're running the program. You should know what these folks need. And of course, the Office of Budget and or Management and Budget (OMB) is an important tool for the president in that regard. And they do a number of things. I mean, they obviously compile the budget, but then they also have extensive audit functions, and they can actually control what we call the burn rate, the amount of money that an agency is spending at any particular point in time. They can issue directives and say, you're spending too much money, stop, or slow down. We're only going to authorize this much, expenditure on a monthly basis. So budgeting is really important. I think, when this chapter, I think, does a pretty good job of detailing the challenges of deficit spending and the national debt, and of course the debt ceiling, which I'll talk about briefly in turn. Um, Deficit spending, simply speaking, is where you're spending more money than you're bringing in. Certainly, people that have households understand that reality. Sometimes there are times when you have to spend more money than you have. If you have a hospital bill, if you have some significant expenditure that you believe will dramatically improve your productivity, those are rationales for deficit spending. And you get what you pay for, right? I mean, I say this on an individual basis. If you go into debt buying a house, that's a wise and prudent investment. If you go into debt running up a credit card bill at a strip club, well, you might look back fondly at those experiences, but that's not necessarily money well spent, right? So it's similar, although not the same. The reality is macroeconomics and microeconomics are very separate events, very separate kinds of spending. And again, the reality is, though, you get what you pay for with deficits. If you're running deficits to stimulate the economy, and what you're doing the deficit on has real value, building the federal highway system, for example, or defense expenditure, fighting World War II, these are debts worth accruing. If you're simply cutting taxes and you're not really achieving anything with those tax cuts, which I think is one of the main complaints that a lot of people feel with regard to the Trump tax cuts of 2017, then what you're really doing is simply adding to the national debt without real value. And a lot of people, what is the national debt? This is the total of all the deficits that we've been running. And we've really been engaging in deficit spending since around the early 1980s, when the first Trump, or not first Trump tax cut, but the first Reagan tax cuts went into effect. It's interesting that Reagan cut taxes big initially in 1981. Then he subsequently raised taxes 4 different times over the course of his second term, because that was the responsible thing to do. That tends to get lost in the mythology surrounding Ronald Reagan. But certainly George Herbert Walker Bush paid the price for doing the responsible thing, because he actually did the same thing, in 1990. And frankly, a lot of conservatives defected from him and voted for Ross Perot in 1992. And I think that was an important reason why he lost. And I think that subsequent Republicans have learned that lesson, and it has sort of scourged the Republican Party of any sense of responsibility as it relates to fiscal policy. It seems to me like what's the old Russian proverb? When your only tool is a hammer, every problem is a nail. For a lot of Republicans at the federal level, the response to every problem is, well, we'll cut taxes. I'm basically making an argument. I'm not saying that I'm always right, but I'm making an argument here that that's not always a responsible approach to fiscal policy. The debt ceiling is part of the constitutional realities that the Congress has to both authorize and appropriate monies, and of course all spending bills originate in the House of Representatives, which is supposed to be the most democratic body of the federal government. There have been arguments in recent years, and we played this game of chicken, where people have said, well, we're not going to authorize raising the debt ceiling. And both sides have done it for different reasons, different kind of symbolic reasons. The consequences of not raising the debt ceiling are significant, because you could end up with a currency crisis where, we should always remember, yes, we owe a lot of money to the Japanese and the Chinese and the Saudis and other people, but most of the U.S. debt, the $20.1 trillion, is actually owed to Americans, to American banks and American financial institutions. So defaulting on the federal debt is simply a really bad idea. And we have never done it to this point. Now, in contrast, Greece, for example, has defaulted on its currency like close to 20 times in 150 years. It seems like they do it every 15, 20 years. So, I mean, that's the reason why Greece is Greece. So when people say, and they were saying this quite a bit, during Obama's latter period, oh, we're going to become like Greece. That is one of the most nonsensical statements to anyone that understands macroeconomics that you can possibly make. The United States has the largest economy in the world by several dimensions, orders of magnitude. We have one of the most diverse economies in the world. Greece, in contrast, has a very limited economy. They do agriculture, they do tourism, they do shipping, and not a lot else. And they're an incredibly top-heavy state with enormous regulatory issues. We do not have their regulatory problems, and frankly, we are simply nowhere in the vicinity of having a debt issue that would lead us to becoming like Greece. Now, we do have a debt issue, and we should be thinking seriously about resolving it. But again, that's sort of the challenge that you face. I think it's interesting that half of our debt, or half of our annual budget, is in 3 programs, right? Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare. So when people say about how big our welfare system is and everything else, that's really not true. It's really these 3 programs. And if you want to talk about reducing the size and scope of the federal government and the rate of taxation, you have to address those 3 programs, and you have to address them in a way that that is meaningful. I've had people say, well, I don't think that Social Security, we should just get rid of it. I'm like, hold on, man. I've been paying into Social Security for my whole life, and I want that money back. I think I have a right to it. So people wanting to say these kinds of things about domestic spending, and that's a hobby horse of a lot of people. Let's get rid of let's lower domestic spending. Let's reduce the size of the federal government to the point where we could drown it in a bathtub if we needed to. Well, keep in mind, a lot of that money is money that people think they deserve, and they're not going to just give up on it easily. Again, I would note a lot of the complaints coming from the Affordable Care Act when Democrats tried to reform the healthcare system. you had lots and lots of conservatives saying, keep your hands off my Medicare. So they weren't actually saying, I don't like this socialized medicine. They're saying, I like Medicare. Well, guess what? Medicare is the most socialistic aspect of the federal government. And so you even have conservatives that are saying, I will bleed and die to protect Medicare. So that's where our politics is. So in any event, got a lot to talk about this week. So hopefully we'll have a fun discussion. Let's have a great week.